Steve Niva will describe how these actions have brought about the death of the two-state solution and why the United States should abandon this flawed territorial approach and should adopt a new right-based approach to the conflict that reaffirms Israeli rights while paying equal attention to long neglected Palestinian rights. So now I'm going to turn it over to Steve Niva, who's going to share his screen and take over the presentation.
Okay, should I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, all right. Well, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Pete, for inviting me. It was almost a year ago, and I wasn't sure what my topic would be. Turned out I'm happy I picked this topic a year later. But thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's great to have you all here. Of course, I wish we could be in person, not least because usually the Olympia World Affairs Council provides a wonderful dinner and a glass of wine before dinner, and I didn't get that tonight. I had to do it at home. But it's great to see you all, and I hope everybody's in good health and managing this still difficult time that we're living through. So I'm gonna share my screen, and then I'm gonna talk for about hopefully 35 minutes, and I look forward to your questions. So let me set that up right for you now. Okay, and one more click. There we go. Can everybody see this okay? I hope so. Okay, so I have given myself maybe a challenging task tonight of trying to persuade some of you, many of you, I've had to already persuade myself to rethink the way I've understood the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in fact, to change the mental and political paradigm in which I've long understood both the nature of this conflict and the way it could be resolved. And so that's what I'm going to try and do with you tonight. I may not succeed. I'll look forward to your questions, and we'll talk about what I'm proposing us to think about later. But it has to do with this map that we're looking at. And I'm going to suggest that actually we've got to rethink the way we look at a map like this when we think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm going to base this talk off of especially the two books on the left. In fact, I cribbed the language almost directly from Ian Lustig, his recent book, Paradigm Lost, From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality, which I highly recommend. Ian is a political scientist in University of Pennsylvania, a very distinguished scholar and thinker. And also this new report that came out from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace called Breaking the Israel-Palestine Status Quo, where they argue for what I'm going to be taking up, that the US needs to adopt a rights-based approach to the conflict in order to address this new reality that Ian lays out. And the last book I'll mention to you is a wonderful memoir by Kai Bird called Crossing the Mandelbaum Gate. And I guess this is just to suggest the perspective that I'm coming with, which is Kai grew up in the same neighborhood that I grew up, or that I lived for several years when I was young in East Jerusalem. And Kai lived there 10 years earlier than me, and almost we have like these parallel lives 10 years apart. And we experienced a lot of the same things growing up, living in these neighborhoods. And since I lived there in the early 1970s, I've been able to go back to Israel-Palestine probably every 6 or 7 years, sometimes every 2 or 3 or 4 years. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is a reflections based on my experiences in the area and watching it change over time. Okay, so here's the main story. Here's my thesis. I'm going to suggest that for the last 30 years in particular, many of us, including myself, have come to think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the following way, which I'm going to say is paradigm lost. It no longer operates, it's no longer operative, and we need to let go of this. And that is thinking about this conflict, that it's a conflict between two peoples in one land that can be solved through partition, that we can do a territorial separation of these two peoples and bring about peace. And that Israel can withdraw from territory or settlements or take certain kinds of actions that would enable a viable Palestinian state to emerge, and that via negotiations, a peace deal can be reached. This, I will argue, is no longer operative and we need to let go. Okay, so I have a big task ahead of me. Maybe some of you believe strongly in this. And I'm going to argue that we're in a new era. We're in a new reality right now. And I'm going to call that the one state reality. That as it exists right now, and I don't think there's any going back, there's only one state. State of Israel exerts complete sovereignty over the entire territory. The population has more or less been integrated into the legal, political, and economic rule of one state, and that's Israel. I don't think there's any possibility left of an independent and viable Palestinian state, given the territorial, political, and cultural transformations that have existed. And I think any solution of the future will only be about the composition of this one state, will no longer be about a peace negotiation between two peoples to create two states. So that's where I'm going. Let's see how I get there. And I'll see you at the end of the road here. So the first thing I want to talk about is the rise and fall of partition, and the idea that you can solve this conflict through some sort of territorial partition, and with it, the end of the two-state solution, which I think we should no longer even consider. It's not on the table anymore. So I'm not going to go over the whole history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Obviously, that would take years, but as we all know, this is a conflict that begins about 150 years ago with the arrival of European Zionist settlers wanting to settle in the historic land of Eretz Israel, and eventually guided by Theodor Herzl with the idea of creating a Jewish state. That's the essence of Zionism, create a Jewish state, or at least the interpretation that was dominant amongst the early settlers into Palestine. And of course, we had at the same time the rise at the end of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of Arab nationalism, the emergence of Palestinian identity within a broader Arab nationalist experience, and therefore the conflict emerges between Israelis and Palestinians. And Britain, of course, rules this area from 1920 to 1948. And this is sort of an example of where the early Jewish settlement happens. So this is where we first get the idea of partition, that maybe a way to solve this budding conflict is to separate the two peoples into separate territorial spaces. And the first example of partition is Britain's Peel Commission proposal of 1937. And as you can see, the idea was to create a Jewish state here, a Palestinian Arab state here, and to have some sort of mandated British controlled zone between Jerusalem and Jaffa, Tel Aviv. This was seen as a declaration of war by the Zionist movement, which completely rejected it, and also by the Palestinian national movement that was emerging at that time, which did not believe that their homeland was something that they had to share with another people, or that it should even be divided. The second example of partition we saw in this early period was the UN resolution in 1947, when Britain was going to leave the land and turned it over to the United Nations, and the United Nations Committee got together and decided, well, again, the way to solve this is we have to separate these two peoples, Arabs and Jews, and they came up with this territorial dispensation that you see on the map, about 55% of the land going to the new Jewish state of Israel and about 45% going to the Palestinian Arab state that was supposed to be created. And of course, as we know, this didn't happen. War broke out, and at the end of the war, the new state of Israel is declared, and here are the borders and boundaries, right? The state of Israel is declared from the north, Lebanon, down to the south, Egypt, and you have this piece of territory Jordan takes over and occupies against the wishes of most Palestinians, and Egypt takes over the Gaza Strip, again, not favored by the Palestinian population. But that's basically the territory we get. And it appears for a while that the idea of partition is over, that that's no longer an issue we need to think about. But in 1967, another war broke out, and Israel took over the remaining territory of Mandate Palestine, what we call the West Bank and what we call the Gaza Strip. It also took over the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, but let's leave that aside from our main story. It occupies the West Bank and Gaza. And at that time then, the idea of partition returns as a possible option for peace or for some kind of resolution to the situation in historic Palestine. And that is after the War of 67, once Israel takes over the West Bank and Gaza, the United Nations passes a resolution, 242, which some of you have probably heard about. And 242 is very simple. The framework is land for peace. In other words, the framework is that to have peace between Israel and its Arab neighbors, including its Palestinians, you have two things going on. One is the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, i.e. West Bank and Gaza. And in exchange, the peace, the termination of all claims or states of belligerency in respect of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of every state in the area, meaning Israel. In other words, an end to the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Arab conflict. Land for peace. Israel withdraws from the territories it occupied and in exchange gets a full peace, and the UN would broker this. This brings back the idea of partition to this territory because it makes possible the idea of a two-state solution, that there will be a state of Israel again, and that this time, instead of Jordanian occupation and Egyptian occupation, it becomes an independent Palestinian state with possibly some kind of connector between Gaza and the West Bank. So partition idea comes back, okay, with Jerusalem, maybe a shared capital or a divided capital, and that this could be the resolution of this conflict. In fact, in 1969, the Secretary of State at the time, William Rogers, actually puts forward a plan, the Rogers Plan, that would encourage the adoption of Resolution 242, that Israel withdraw from the territories, Palestinian state gets created, and the neighboring states recognize Israel's right to exist. And in this case, Israel rejected it, saying it wanted it wanted a period of waiting to see of how things would turn out. But it was on the table, 1969, this idea. Well, what happens after then is that you end up with a debate inside Israel over what to do with these newly occupied territories. And the debate is basically between, let's say, the center left, the Labor Party in Israel, and the center right and the far right in Israel, the Likud and some other members. At that time, it was kind of almost a two-party state, and some other members that mattered. The labor position was not land for peace. You know, we're in favor of withdrawing completely from these occupied territories in exchange for peace. But the Labor Party concept was, we'll partition the West Bank and partition Gaza. That's land for peace in the Labor Party's interpretation of it. And famously, it's called the Alon Plan. In fact, one could argue, in many ways, this is what's guided labor policy and Israeli policy, even to the present day. And the idea was to retain most of the territory, but not the Palestinians. And the Palestinians could eventually either ally with Jordan or somehow no longer be under Israeli control, but the remaining territory state. On the other side, on the center right to the far right, led by Ariel Sharon, who actually was a member kind of on the edge of the Labor Party, but really is a center right figure, was not, let's divide the West Bank and have that be land for peace, but let's expand Jewish settlement and prevent the emergence of a viable Palestinian state. And Ariel Sharon was very clear about this. There's no real historical debate over Ariel Sharon's plan. Ariel Sharon spent incredible amounts of time poring over the maps. This is the best picture of Sharon you would ever, you read Sharon's biography, etc. Sharon was all about every inch of the territory of historic Palestine, historic Israel, whatever you want to call it. And he knew every inch, and he knew how to play every inch. And he was very clear about what he wanted to do, and you can see it on the map here. Since 1978, what Israel has done is, and this is Sharon's strategic vision, was to implant Israeli settlements around and between all existing Palestinian population centers to prevent their growth and connectivity, thereby preventing the emergence ever of a Palestinian state. Okay, so take a look. So everything in blue and light blue shading is land controlled by Israel in the West Bank, territory occupied in 1967. Everything in the dark blue, the really dark blue, or even the dark colors here, are Israeli settlements, okay? The built out land base of the Israeli settlements. Everything that's in yellow and orange and the darker kind of red here, these are where Palestinian population centers are. And so if you look at it, you can see the blue, right, is bisecting, dividing, surrounding, separating, and preventing contiguity and continuity, and especially here in the middle, right? And of course, taking over the entire Jordan Valley. So you can see that Palestinians are living increasingly in islands of territorial space surrounded by Israeli settlement and landhold. And this is by design. This is not a random development. And as we can see, the settlements grew larger and larger over time. Some huge, these aren't trailer homes. These are large, small cities, large development towns. And of course, they grew across the territory. And at this point, probably 55% of the territory of the West Bank is under the territorial control of these Jewish Israeli settlements. Israel also, in the early 80s, annexed the Golan Heights, so that's the Syria story, but then annexed Jerusalem. So taking Jerusalem off the table of a possible land for peace agreement. And by the late 1980s, actually, many analysts, most famously this Israeli sociologist and former deputy minister of Jerusalem, Meron Ben-Venisti, had said, maybe a two-state solution isn't even possible anymore. So this is the late 80s. Maybe a two-state solution isn't possible anymore because of all these settlements and the way that they've developed over time, precisely as Ariel Sharon and far-right parties in the Likud and the Greater Israel faction in Israeli politics were hoping. But then there was the Palestinian uprising of 1987. And Palestinians were tired of settlement growth, tired of the constrictions on their lives, the restrictions of their political communities. They were deeply infiltrated by Israeli Shin Bet secret police with whole collaborator networks, subject to extreme restrictions of a military occupation. And they rose up, and intifada just means shaking up. And they rose up and they were demanding freedom and independence. Except how would they articulate that? And then an Israeli peace movement emerged. Actually, a peace movement of the left emerges at the same time. And they're calling for that original dispensation of UN 242. Land for peace, Israel needs to withdraw the settlers and soldiers out of the West Bank and Gaza in exchange for peace, and thereby calling for a two-state solution. So it's really interesting at this time, a two-state solution was actually the left position. Was actually those on the left calling for a two-state solution. And of course, many were shouted down and ignored. And amongst Palestinians, this became the dominant paradigm, was a two-state solution as well. And for many outside, I would include myself here, this is the model of how to solve this conflict that I also accepted at this time. It seemed like, the best of a tough situation. And so out of the intifada and the rise of new voices across Israel, there was the idea that maybe some peace agreement could happen with UN Resolution 242 being the basis of some kind of partition that could lead to peace. And this was called the Oslo Accords. Well, many Palestinians believed that the Oslo Accords actually was going to lead to this two-state solution. So this was the model they had in their head. West Bank, Gaza, with a connector between the two, some kind of overpass or something, a protected overpass system through this area, and that actually a two-state solution could be achieved. And in fact, the plurality of Palestinians actually supported this concept. And many in the Israeli left supported this concept. But what Oslo ended up doing was it ended up creating a protracted quagmire. Basically, what Oslo did was Israel pulled out of only the heavily populated Palestinian areas of the West Bank and allowed municipal, basically control by Palestinians under the Palestinian Authority. And then it created kind of a joint administration over most Palestinian population centers. And then finally, it reserved the other area they called Area C, which is precisely where Ariel Sharon's settlement map was being implemented. So this was where Israel had full control, full sovereign control over Area C. So it was only a partial map, and it certainly wasn't a partition and a separation and a viable and independent Palestinian state. This is another way of looking at it. Areas A, where the big cities are, areas B, the outerlying areas, and area C, fully controlled by Israel. During this whole period then, while negotiations were going on over a future settlement, possibly, Israel was continuing to build settlements in Area C, actually at an expanded rate. Settlers were increasingly a very belligerent part of Israel's occupation, particularly in Hebron. And of course, like in Ma'ale Adumim, in Jerusalem area, this extensive it almost goes down to the Dead Sea from Jerusalem. Ma'ale Adumim is on these hillsides. I remember as a kid driving down to the Dead Sea, and it was just shepherds and Bedouin and goat herds and stuff. And now you drive down there, and it's this monstrous settlement that almost bisects the entire West Bank from Jerusalem to the Jordan River. And basically, this is what I'm saying. Israeli settlement growth happens along the map that Ariel Sharon created, and it bisects and divides Palestinian areas. Increasingly, Palestinians are living in these kind of separated islands. And here's Ma'ale Adumim right in the middle. It kind of goes all the way down the hillside and, of course, inside. And so this is the situation that's confronting the idea of a partition. How can you partition this? It's getting more and more difficult to do. And then in 2000 in Camp David, Clinton met with Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, and they tried to hammer out maybe the final chance to partition this land in a positive way, in a way that could lead to peace. And here's basically the map that Israel demanded. I mean, Barak was like, this is one and done. He says, here's the map, we're not negotiating, take it or leave it. And you can read all the inside accounts of the Camp David Accords. And basically it's a little bit close to the Sharon map with some modifications. But as you can see, Israel was going to control the entire Jordan Valley, bisect the West Bank. Palestinians would be in 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 different territorial cantons with probably some bridges or connectors between them. And famously, Palestinians did not accept this map. They demanded to continue negotiations, but Barak was pretty clear that this was your best chance you were going to get. And as you can see, from a Palestinian point of view, this was not an independent contiguous state. This was not a partition. This was rather a partition of a partition from their standpoint. There was one last chance to make peace. I'm just showing you that a better deal was possible in Taba and Geneva, but those fell through. And they were less onerous. They created a contiguous Palestinian state with land swaps, so a better deal could have been had. But unfortunately, war broke out after that. You saw Israel reoccupied the West Bank. Palestinian militancy grew with the rise of Hamas and the Islamic movement in Gaza in particular. We saw the increase in suicide bombings. And then we have to go back to the map. Israel begins building a separation barrier now, but it builds inside the West Bank. So we have the settlements, we have the infrastructure of settlements, and now we have walls and fences also within the territory. 90% of it is built inside the West Bank. And if you've ever been there, you know exactly what this looks like. These walls are snaking through entire territories, always extending the land of Israeli settlements, limiting the land of Palestinian inhabitants every time. So for example, this is the Palestinian farmland, with the walls built as close to Palestinian neighborhoods as possible. Now, that is in Israel, according to the wall, inside the West Bank. And it's the same you see throughout. Here's Bethlehem. Walls pushed right up into Bethlehem. These are Bethlehem's fields, but they can't get there unless they have a permit. And actually, they can't get there. These lands will be taken over by Israeli settlements or others. Some of it's a gated fence. Some of these Palestinian towns are behind these fences, and in and out is through these armed gates. So this is the situation you get. You have a new geography now where Israeli-only roads are bisecting Palestinian communities, connecting up all the settlement blocks. And if you are a Palestinian, this is the way your world looks. You can't get out of your area unless you have a pass, and you have to go through Israeli security to get that pass, which is very difficult to get. And often you're asked to provide intel on your community. It becomes a very difficult situation, but this is sort of the life of Palestinians. And I just want to say I've spent a lot of time here. And because I have an American passport, I can get from these areas to one another. But I can give you one example. Over here in Anata is one of my best Palestinian friends and his family. He has to work his uncle has a underwear shop in Bethlehem, and he runs it on the weekends. He's a surgical nurse in the daytime, but he runs it on the weekend. So he has to drive down some snaky road, coming up through the backside into Bethlehem. It's the only way he can get there. And then back through the snaky road to Anata. But he's lucky because he actually has a pass. He can get through Israeli checkpoints. So this is kind of the reality we're living in now. There's the Gaza withdrawal. I'm going to skip through that. But Israel withdrew all its settlers and soldiers from Gaza, and Gaza is now under a permanent state of siege. So there's one last chance at the two-state solution, but it doesn't really go anywhere. One last chance to partition this increasingly fragmented and divided and controlled and bisected piece of territory. Ehud Olmert, Israeli prime minister, he's facing corruption charges, but he's going to give it a go. Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian PA leader, you can see President Bush there. But really, this was just a window dressing opportunity. But the map is kind of interesting. It's a better map than Palestinians had at Camp David. However, it wasn't going to go anywhere politically, and Olmert gave it up pretty quickly. And then, of course, we have one last. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this, but this was dead on arrival. I call it the Prince's Plan. It was Jared Kushner's plan, or Kinsey Consultants plan. I think that's where he got it. When President Trump basically authorized Jared to read some books and to come up with the deal of the century between Palestinians, Israelis, and the entire Middle East. And I mean, I'm sorry, I just can't take this one that seriously when you look at it. But nevertheless, basically what it was Ariel Sharon's map. Palestinians just had to accept that as the reality. This is basically what it looks like on the right-hand side. There could be maybe some tunnels and bridges in between some of these territories, a little tunnel to Gaza, and Palestinians would have to then renounce any other rights, any other claims, and they could live in these small enclaves and call it a state, whatever they wanted to call it. But that was dead on arrival. That wasn't going to happen, and that hasn't gone anywhere and won't go anywhere. And basically, with that, I want to say the two-state solution is over. I think it's done. That's it. And so we are now in a new reality where, because of what I showed you, there is only now one territorial reality, and that's one state controls the entire territory, and everybody who lives on it exerts full and complete sovereignty de facto, if not de jure, because they haven't formally annexed the entire territory, but there's no other power. The entire population has been integrated into this one state apparatus. It's legal, it's economic, it's political system. There's no possibility for a viable or independent Palestinian state from a territorial dimension, or from a political dimension, or from an economic dimension. I mean, there's no hinterland now, right? All of the arable space that Palestinians could have used for feeding their population or agriculture has largely now become Israeli settlement space. And so I would argue that the only kinds of resolutions that exist are no longer partitioned in two states, but what's the dispensation of this one state? What will this be? So let me just tell you why I think this is the only reality in town now. and then I'll conclude with some comments about US policy and where I think it should go. First, as I said, Israel exerts full sovereignty over the entire territory. And that includes everybody. All Israeli Jews who have citizenship, Palestinian Arabs who have Israeli citizenship, and Palestinians who live under Palestinian Authority. It's all subject to Israeli rule. All these enclaves that ostensibly are ruled by Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, let's get real. Israel has full control over the population registry, all ID cards, all travel inside and outside through checkpoints and tracking, water, electricity, telecommunications, transport systems, all controlled by Israel. Nature and quality of this Palestinian local police force or its military capabilities, all determined by Israel. Housing, development, land use, all determined by Israel. And basically the municipal affairs are left to Palestinians. So in other words, all these Palestinian enclaves that I've shown you on the map are more or less just neighborhoods within Israel that have municipal control subject to the Israeli Knesset, the laws that are made there. They're all subject to Israeli sovereign law and rule. All Jewish settlers, there's no more occupation. All Jewish settlers have now been fully integrated within Israeli laws and into the state with full rights. They are voting in the settlements. The Knesset in Jerusalem passes laws regarding the settlers and their lives. They are fully integrated into Israeli society. All 600 to 700,000 Israeli settlers are fully integrated in Israel. Israel rules an integrated map. This is the water system. I could give you any number of maps. There's no West Bank, Gaza. There's no, it's one state. The territorial roads and networks are all integrated. I mean, you could start in Tel Aviv and drive across all of the West Bank, all throughout north-south stuff. And you know, if you're Israeli or you're American or have a foreign passport, you wouldn't notice any difference. There's no border boundary, anything. If you're a Palestinian, though, it makes a difference. I mean, in some cases there are entryways that you have to get into, but more or less it's a fully integrated road network and utilities network, water network, etc. Israel's leading political parties, if you look at the two recent elections, there was no debate over two-state solutions. This was not on the table. Naftali Bennett is the new prime minister of Israel. He is a former leader of the settler movement. He's a very urbane and educated former investment banker in the US. He spent some time and he's always been very clear there will never be a Palestinian state, and he'll make sure there will never be a Palestinian state. And he talks about shrinking the conflict, saying, but there could be a better life for Palestinians, and he would work to make that happen, but not political rights and not independence. Very clear. And there's really no debate there at the highest levels these days. The only real debate is whether you should formally annex the West Bank, Area C, and more, or not. And that's really the debate today in Israel. I would argue that even deeper, the longer term trend that we're seeing, and I edited a couple pieces by some Israeli scholars about this last year, is increasingly within Israel, actually, you're seeing the hegemony of religious Zionism is the movement. Naftali Bennett comes from that movement, but increasingly, it's much larger, about 15% of Israelis sort of identify with this movement, but they're a very powerful bloc. And they believe the entire territory is the patrimony of Jewish people. Israel should fully annex the entire territory. Non-Jews, Arabs, Palestinians are foreigners and should have limited residency rights or perhaps expulsion, and that the Israeli government should be based on religious law. The governance should be based on religious law. And this is a movement growing in strength, and you see this in the last two elections quite significantly. And you also saw this in the passing a couple years ago of the Jewish nation state law, that it's basically a constitutional, a foundational constitutional legal principle now. And downgrades Arabic, says that only Jews have the right to self-determination in the land, and that the priority of the state is to settle its Jewish citizens, and so on and so forth. And there's nothing about equality. There's very little about democracy as well, which really reflects that new viewpoint. Nearly to the end, I would say that the regional environment now also favors this one state reality. In the past, Israel was very concerned that it was worried about the Arab world and the threats from the Arab world. And there was a lot of pressure maybe to make a deal with Palestinians. That's no longer the case. Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Sudan, Morocco, they're all on board. They're not pressuring Israel anymore. They'd like Israel to do more for Palestinians, but they were basically willing to go along with the Trump-Abraham Accords. So there's not really the regional pressure anymore either. So again, why I think that we're just in this new reality. And then finally, I would say that the critics of what Israel does, like its left-wing or human rights critics or others, they no longer are talking about ending the occupation. They're no longer saying, we don't like what you're doing in the West Bank and Gaza. They're actually saying, we don't like this one state. And this is really important. You probably heard about these apartheid reports that came out in the past couple of years. Human Rights Watch asserted that Israel created an apartheid regime, a regime of ethno-religious supremacy. B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights group, issued a report, a very stunning report. It really demands reading, actually, in how clearly they make this argument. And there's several, Yesh Din and some other groups also. And basically, the critics of certain Israeli practice and behavior, as I'm trying to say, are also reflecting the one state reality. And they're saying that you have one state, you have one set of rules and laws for one people, Israeli Jewish citizens, and another set of rules and laws for another people, Palestinian Arab inhabitants, and that in fact this constitutes a systemic discrimination and inequality, a situation of structural discrimination, which is a kind of ethno-religious or racial supremacist state. And they're using the legal terminology of apartheid to express that. So for example, B'Tselem's report, Human Rights Watch report, a threshold crossed. And basically the argument is you have roughly 7 million Jews, 7 million Arabs, but only one has full rights to mobility, dwelling, land use, state resources, et cetera. And that following this, I think from their point of view, any idea of a two-state solution, like we saw with the Trump plan, is more or less like the Bantustan system in South Africa, because it's not a viable, independent, equal rights venture. It would be a very limited, subjected to unequal dispensations, incorporated, a subordinate enclave within a bigger state that controls every aspect of it. So, like the Bantustan system. So to conclude then, I want to just say, well, where are we? If I'm arguing we're in a one-state reality, the territorial, the political, the economic, the legal, we're just in, it's one state now. That's what it is. Well, what are the scenarios of resolution? Well, what I want to argue is it's basically what kind of one state should exist. I think that's where we are right now. And I would argue there's 4 scenarios. One scenario is the status quo, which Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Yesh Din, a lot of groups are saying is a regime of systemic inequality or a kind of apartheid system. In strong language, but they lay it out and you can read for yourself what you think of that. But that's the status quo right now. So we could have Israel annexes the West Bank, does not extend citizenship and equal rights to its Arab inhabitants. And so you have separate and unequal systems being set up, right? Say with Gaza would be also excluded from Israel's legal rights and political franchise. That's one possibility, status quo, one state. The second option would be a unitary and equal Israel. In other words, Israel annexes this entire land, but extends equal rights and franchise to its Arab inhabitants. But it's still the state of Israel with the Zionist institutions and so on and so forth, but all its citizens actually have rights to franchise, rights to political participation, and so on. And what's really interesting here is the outgoing right-wing Israeli president, Rivlin, absolutely opposes a Palestinian state, but he's a very interesting figure. There's a piece in the New Yorker about him about 3 years ago. I would really look him up. He is actually calling, he says Israel should annex the entire land. There should never be a Palestinian state. But the first thing he would do is grant citizenship. You see here, the imposition of Israeli sovereignty begins with the granting of citizenship to all who inhabit the territory. It's a very interesting figure. He's from the right, but he believes in equality. So in some ways, he's kind of almost an old revisionist Zionist, which believes in Israeli Jewish sovereignty over the land, however, granting, but also cares about democratic principles. It's an interesting perspective. The third option, I would say, is some kind of confederal or binationalist, where you have one state with federal unity, but you have each group has equal rights or equal shares in state resources and so on. It's kind of like what you see in Switzerland or Belgium or some of these multi-ethnic, multi-communal, or Canada with Quebec, right? That you have sort of reserved rights for the different communities, some kind of representation in the political system, a single state, but you have kind of autonomy to these different communities within them. So some kind of confederal or binational setup. And actually, there's real conversations going on about that right now as we speak. In fact, I know Sam Bahur here, and Avram Berg is a very interesting Israeli figure, former member of the Knesset, chairman of the Jewish Agency. Finally, I'd say the fourth would be a unitary state, but with equal citizenship, and it's no longer Israel. Some new configuration, but it's a single state, everyone, one person, one vote, equal rights for everybody, not binational, not confederal. But in this case, it's no longer Israel. You could give it a new name, Israel stuff, Pal Israel, combine it whatever you want, but that's the fourth model. So I hope you see these models. We can talk about them later. Status quo, which is a separate and unequal system, a regime of supremacy, a unitary Israel. So it's Israel, but it allows equal rights to all its citizens, or all its inhabitants have equal citizenship, a confederal or binational state, or a unitary state that's no longer Israel. It's reinvented through Palestinian-Israeli collaboration, something. Ali Abu Namaz's book kind of talks about this, Virginia Tilley's book talks about this. So I'm going to conclude now with the implications for US policy of my argument, and then I'll look forward to hearing your comments and questions. So what should US policy do? Well, I think the first thing is just recognize the reality. The two-state solution is done. It's over. It's a paradigm that no longer matters. In fact, I would argue it's not only a distraction, but even bringing it up now is actually now a position of the right. It's actually become a regressive position because it reinforces the status quo, in which there's no longer a viable Palestinian state to be found. There's no longer the political conditions for this. And in fact, it's a fairly repressive sort of environment that's existing of a separate and unequal system. And I think it's time mostly just to recognize that reality. And I think the second thing that's really important is, I did mention these possible scenarios for a one state, but I think the US needs to get out of the solution business. That's the second. The solution has to come from Israelis and Palestinians. The US can provide frameworks though, and that's what I'm interested in. So stop peace processing, stop ideas of partition in two states, stop trying to find the solution. Basically, I would argue, and this is what Breaking the Status Quo, this report from Carnegie argues, is adopt a rights-based policy. Rights first. In other words, the rights and security of everybody living in this one state, Israelis and Palestinians, it doesn't matter. That's what the US should prioritize. Are there democratic rights? Are there equal rights? Do people have freedom for mobility? Can people live where they want to live? Are people being discriminated against? Can people have housing where they'd like? Can people build, farm and have agriculture where they want? Is there equal justice? Is that possible? I think you see where I'm going with this. That actually is, I think, what the US position should be. Treat Israel as if it's just one state, like it treats other states around the world. And so if I were to give my policy recommendations, and this dovetails with that report, I would say adopt a rights-based approach, prioritizes the rights and freedoms of all Israelis and Palestinians. And so I want to be really clear here. This means if the Palestinian Authority or groups like Hamas are repressing their people, the US should call that out because these are violations of basic rights and freedoms. If Israel is limiting Palestinians' mobility through onerous checkpoints, preventing them from building a second story in their house, while granting Israeli settlers right next door the ability to build a 5-star hotel, the US should call that out. In other words, equal justice to everyone in this one state territory. And this is the key principle, that make it really clear the US won't support any dispensation that, like, in other words, an ultimate solution that fails to guarantee the full equality and enfranchisement of all those living within this one state, okay? And then I think finally the key issue would be to establish mechanisms for oversight, end-use monitoring, and accountability for all military, economic, and political support given to any of the actors in this territory. The US gives a lot of money to Israel, as we know, nearly $4 billion a year. And actually this extended over a decade in advance. And it gives a lot of money to Palestinian Authority. And I think my position, and I think that's the position of this Breaking the Impasse document, is it's time just to balance the tables here and just talk about rights and make that the focus. And what that might lead to is any kind of an outcome. And frankly, this could be open in some future that I can't even imagine now, where a two-state solution somehow became possible, which I don't think is even possible. It would enable one maybe to get there, but as I'm arguing, I can't see that happening, and I think it's time just to get rid of that idea. What we need to be doing is pushing for political freedom and equality and franchise. I think that's it. And however that will look, be indifferent to that outcome, whichever those last three models I mentioned, because all those three models are compatible with equal rights and franchise, but they have different elements to them, right? And I think that's getting out of the solution business. So I think that's it for my talk, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve. Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute myself. Very interesting presentation tonight, and I think it will spark a lot of great questions. What I want to do now is encourage people to continue typing your questions into the chat box. And I do recognize that we have a couple of people who are joining us by phone. So what I'd like to do is I'll ask the first question in the chat box to give those people a chance, if they've been thinking up a question, to gather themselves. And then I want to give the people joining us by phone the opportunity to unmute themselves and ask the question, since they're not able to type in the chat box. So I'll ask the first question in the chat box. So if we are accepting the one state of Israel, does that mean we're accepting acquisition of land by conquest?
Oh, that's the question.
Yeah,
okay, great.
That's for you.
All right, got it. Yeah, it's a good question. Let me think through the implications of that question. I mean, I would have to say, in a sense, yes, and I'm gonna say that it doesn't mean accepting it morally or legally. It means accepting it politically as a practical reality. That is the situation we're in, and that there is not any chance to change that situation right now. And so that the most important way to counterbalance the fact that indeed that land was acquired illegally is to emphasize the implementation of human rights on that land today. There's no perfect solution here, but but I don't see holding on to a position that this is acquired illegally, and therefore we should have a political approach to it that basically is at odds with the reality of the new situation. I don't think that's viable. So it's tragic, but that's where we are historically. And I think it needs to be acknowledged. And in fact, I would argue that the illegal takeover of land, probably in my own personal preferred dispensation, would require some kind of reparations and historical justice. But I'm trying to make the case that we are simply living in a new reality, and we just have to face up to it. And that means, unfortunately, giving up certain standards that may ethically be right, but are not practically real.
Okay, thank you. So now, before I read the next question, I want to give a moment if either of the people coming to us by phone want to unmute themselves and ask a question. Oh, it looks like, yes, we have one hand raised. So let me try to unmute that person. Doesn't look like I'm able to. Oh, I think, okay, you're live.
My question is concerning the last question. Is there a similarity or lessons to be learned or anything with regard to the United States manifest destiny and what happened within Israel?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I mean, I would argue right now, if you look at the scholarly discussion about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's been a real shift in the last, I would say, decade, and increasingly scholars, Israeli scholars, Palestinian scholars, international scholars, are talking about the process that unfolded from the late 19th century to the present as one of settler colonialism. That actually is the underlying nature of the project that produces the state of Israel. Yes, there's a historical claim to be made about the religious tradition going back on that territory and some parts of it back historically, but that the actual movement, the Zionist movement that emerged in the late 19th century, bears all the hallmarks of other settler colonial movements, much like the movement that creates the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, French Algeria, Rhodesia, and so on. That in fact, there are a great amount of parallels to North America in terms of the question you're asking. And so, in fact, if you look at those territorial spaces and you talk about the status quo right now, in a sense, what we're talking about, if you want to search for an analogy here, would be to the extent that Palestinians are living on reservations. But the problem is that today, they don't even have that subordinate sovereign status that American Indian reservations do in this country. So yeah, there are significant parallels, no doubt.
Thank you.
And that actually ties into another question that we have. Are you arguing that right now the Palestinian areas essentially are like Indian reservations were in the US prior to the 1925 legislation, giving Native Americans living on reservations the right to vote? So I think that's a parallel question.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. To be honest with you, I do prefer the analogy to South African Bantu states. And in fact, there's a historical basis for that, which is that we know now pretty definitively that when Ariel Sharon was trying to figure out what the political dispensation would be for his settlement map that I was trying to go over, of preventing a Palestinian state, a contiguous, a viable Palestinian state from emerging, he spent a lot of time with the South African ambassador and with Israeli ambassadors who've been in South Africa, trying to understand how the Bantustan system worked. And in fact, one could argue that the pass laws are in many ways reproduced in Israel's checkpoint and legal pass system that it uses with Palestinians. And so that's the status quo, is something kind of like that, just an Israeli version that has emerged.
Great. Okay. So the next question we have is, how strong is the Israeli peace movement?
Yeah, at this point, it's at probably its weakest that it's ever been since, I would say, the late 70s. The Israeli peace movement really emerged in 1982 with Israel's invasion of Lebanon. That's actually where peace now emerges. In Hebrew, it's Shalom Akshav, peace now. And then it grew with the Palestinian Intifada. It was very strong at that time. In fact, it was a powerful force in Israel. And then I would argue in the 2000s, it started to decline. And really since the late 2000s, it's no longer a player or a factor. I mean, really what you've seen in Israel, it's very important to notice that the parallels with the United States, where we've seen the rise of kind of a new right? We had the traditional conservatives, and then since 2008 and the financial crisis with the Tea Party, and then eventually the Trump movement, right? The movement that emerges with Trump, you almost see a parallel in Israel, that you had sort of a two-party system with a kind of a peace edge. And then by about the mid 2000s, you see the emergence of a new right in Israel, which I'm calling religious Zionism, becomes a new powerful force in Israel. And in fact, the peace movement shrinks and shrinks. And now it's hardly a factor. Many on the Israeli peace camp have left Israel. It's a very small number of forces right now.
And likely related to that, in terms of the peace process, there's a question: what impact does present regional fissure or conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran play in this peace process?
Yeah. So this is what I was kind of hinting at when I said, so I'm trying to make this case that we live in a one-state reality. And part of the reality is not just the territorial reality, which I really tried to lay out, which I think is just almost irrefutable now, that there's just no possibility for a viable Palestinian state to even be carved out of. You'd have to remove so many settlers, change the infrastructure, bring back land that doesn't exist. I just don't see it happening. But also the political reality no longer favors the idea of a two-state. And one of the aspects I was trying to say is that the regional environment now is no longer putting any pressure on Israel to try and do a two-state solution, to try and cut a deal with Palestinians. And a big part of that is the new alignment that's happened in the Middle East between the Iran coalition and the Saudi-led coalition against Iran. And Israel is a full member now of the Saudi coalition against Iran. And that is part of why there's this new regional order, which no longer is concerned about the Palestinians anymore at the state level, at the elite level, right? Because the Israeli state, the Saudi state, the Gulf states, the Gulf Arab states are basically in an anti-Iran alliance. And that's really what matters. And Israel is a very important player, as you probably have read about. Israeli spyware, the NSO, is used by every Gulf regime now to spy on their own dissidents and their own population. Israeli technical expertise is really important for the Arab Gulf states. And you know that Saudi Arabia, when it gets a chance, will recognize Israel. We're not very far off from that. So yeah, I think it's a big part of why I'm arguing that we no longer live in an environment that is going to push Israel to make any concessions. And we also have just this one state reality, which will just be here for now.
Thank you. The next question is there a land use plan and or law defining how land and water should be used Israel-wide, including Palestinian territories? And there's a little more to it. It says, my opinion is a rights-based country, but the difficulties will come when land and water is to be divided. Is there a long-range land and water use plan based on ecological and climate needs?
Right. Well, I'm not an expert on water and systems, but I do know this. I've read enough about this, which is that, as I'm suggesting, all the water in this one state reality is actually controlled by the Israeli water, the state controlled water system, okay? I mean, all the water that Palestinians get comes through the Israeli system. And right now, if you're in the West Bank or you're in Gaza, for example, Israel put severe restrictions on Palestinian water use as opposed to water use by Israeli settlements. So there is a national plan. And as with the rest of the system that exists right now in the status quo, it favors one side over the other in a separate and unequal kind of fashion. So yeah, there is a water plan, but it's a very unequal water plan. My own view is once we accept the one state reality, and we can emphasize things like, what about equal rights to water? Maybe that should be the struggle, equal rights to water. There should be no restrictions on anybody, regardless of who they are. They should have equal rights to water. I think that could be a struggle that actually Israelis and Palestinians could unite over in this new one state dispensation to lead to maybe new political possibilities. I think that's where we are.
Thank you. The next question is, I may say this word wrong. How many Israeli Arabs serve in the Knesset?
In the Knesset?
Yes.
So that's the Israeli parliament. Yeah, the Knesset is the Israeli parliament. I don't know the exact number right now. It's a small number. It's not equivalent to the percentage of the Palestinian Israeli population, which is about 20% of Israeli citizens are of Palestinian Arab origins. And yeah, I'm trying to think of the number now. There's 3 or 4 parties. But here's the interesting thing that happened in this last election is that, well, let me just say 2 things. One is that there was a Palestinian Arab party in Israel with Israeli citizenship who ran on a platform of equal rights for everyone in Israel. Okay. But they were eventually stripped of their status and declared illegal because they challenged the Zionist basis of the state. So, but in my view now that I'm seeing this one state reality, I think they are what the future may hold here, is that in this one state reality, you're going to see more and more Palestinian Arabs struggling for equal rights in the state and to change that nation state law, okay? But the second story I wanted to tell you was that a maverick Palestinian Arab Israeli citizen and his very small party actually decided for the first time to participate in the political process with a Jewish party. And for the first time, a Jewish party accepted a Palestinian Arab Israeli citizen as a coalition partner. And actually they're kind of a kingmaker, and they're able to get quite a few concessions within the existing system. And in my view, in the future, this is where the politics are going to lie. It's going to have to lie in a participatory political struggle to try and make this one state reality into something more equal, more just, with more franchise.
Okay. So on the Israeli right, how popular is the idea of giving Palestinians equal rights? Do some view it as antithetical?
Yeah. So most on the Israeli right do not accept that position. They favor the status quo. And as I said, the status quo is a separate and unequal system where Palestinians have more or less residency rights in Jerusalem, have limited, they have significant rights within Israel themselves, although they don't have rights to where they can live, because about 85, 90% of Jewish communities have covenants in them that prevent them from selling land to Arabs. They also don't get the same amount percentage-wise of support from the state and access to resources inside Israel, but they do have the rights to franchise and to run, okay? Whereas in Jerusalem, they only have residency rights. In the West Bank, they have land use rights in very limited capacities, and in Gaza, they have 0 rights, okay? So wait, go ahead, remind me of your question. I knew I was heading there.
Oh, sorry. So asking how the Israeli right feels about Palestinians having equal rights.
Right, exactly. So within this context, the Israeli right has accepted that Palestinian citizens of Israel proper, 48 Israel, that they have rights, although they increasingly are trying to limit them. That's why the nation state law was passed recently. They're trying to limit Palestinian rights who have citizenship, okay? And as far as Jerusalem Arabs and West Bank and Gazan Palestinians, they're not interested in extending rights. rights. They want them to live within these enclaves and just accept the status quo. What they're willing to do is to maybe make a more effort. You see this with Naftali Bennett, the current Israeli prime minister. He's willing to make more effort to provide economic opportunity, which would be empowerment zones, kind of Israeli-style maquiadoras for labor in Israeli factories and things like this, but not political rights. Yeah, that's their position. But as I mentioned to you, Reuven Rivlin, a very interesting figure on the right, and some settler leaders who are extremist in many ways, but many of them, they're so passionate about declaring Israeli sovereignty over the entire land that many of them feel that with increasing the potential of Jewish immigration, that they won't worry about becoming a minority in Israel. And so they're willing to extend rights. And that's Reuven Rivlin is a very interesting figure here. But right now, I would say there's not a strong backing to that position.
Okay. And how do the Palestinian refugee camps outside of Israel weigh into this situation?
Well, that can only be a long-term question at this point. Again, I'm just being a realist, okay? I'm not talking about justice. I'm not talking about ethics here. I'm talking about a realistic situation. In some ways, they had more of a chance of coming back to Palestine within the two-state possibility. But even then, Israel always made sure that that could never be an issue on the table. So all of those negotiations I showed you never allowed for some kind of settlement of the Palestinian refugees back inside historic Palestine, okay? But potentially, depending on how the future holds, there could be a possibility of some kind of return or integration. But right now, unfortunately, I'm just saying the reality is that's not on the table in this new one-state situation. I think the struggle, as I'm suggesting, is going to be over what's the character of this one state. Is there going to be equal rights, equal citizenship? Is there going to be full franchise or not? Or what will it be? Is it going to be a confederal, binational, an apartheid, a new kind of state that we can't even imagine? And then I think after that struggle is undertaken, you might be able to consider the issue of refugees. And again, I'm just giving you my analysis of what I see the political and territorial reality being.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a quick comment and then a few more questions. There's a recommendation to read Against Our Better Judgment for a Palestinian view of the creation of Israel. And then the next question is, are the religious differences so different that a one-state solution is even feasible?
Well, let me just keep on repeating the point I'm making. Oh, I think I get the question, sorry. So let me just make sure, because this is what I'm trying to beat into our heads and my own as well. We are living the one state reality now. It is the reality now. It's a one state, okay? So that exists. But if you were asking me, is some kind of one state situation based on equality, equal citizenship and franchise and full freedoms to everybody who lives there, then we have to think about the religious question. You see what I'm getting at? So right now we have one state. That's it. And then do we think religion is the ultimate deal breaker? I would argue no. I don't think it's religion. I think I think the issue still that's very hard for both Israelis and Palestinians. Again, I'm an outsider, so I can only speak from that perspective. But is really nationality. I really think that's the issue. Is feeling a part of a particular nation that, yes, has religious aspects, but for Palestinians, it's Christians and Muslims. And for Israel, obviously Jews, but many different kinds of Judaism that exists. So I don't think there's any simple religious difference that is at stake here. I think it's more the national difference, which is why I would suggest that if I'm just being a realist here, the one state dispensation that I see most likely emerging from this next period in this history would be some kind of binational situation where each community can at least express and reserve some sort of national identity and national rights within some kind of confederation in which maybe territorially they can live anywhere, but have some kind of national expression as Palestinians, as Israelis. I think, hopefully that I'm being clear, I think that's more the issue that's kind of harder to break down than necessarily religion.
Yep, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have just two more questions.
Yeah.
The next one is, do Israelis see their current situation as apartheid? You brought up this concept of putting that label on what's happening. And if so, are they comfortable with that?
Yeah. So no, this is a new issue, and it's a big debate going on. And what's interesting is when you look back historically, you look back even to the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, major Israeli leaders, I'm talking Prime Minister Ehud Barak, Ehud Olmert, even more associated with the right wing, all have said, if we don't figure out a solution to the situation, we will become South Africa, we will become apartheid, because we will be ruling over 5 million Palestinian Arabs who don't have the same rights that are 5 million Israeli Jews at the time. Now it's 7 million. And it will be an apartheid situation. You see, Tzipi Livni said this. I mean, I could go on. There's a whole list of people who said, this will be the reality. Well, here we are 10, 20 years later, and the status quo is that reality. And therefore, what you're seeing is Israelis on the left, and again, I said it's a very small number, are now basically saying that's the situation we live in. So yes, it's in the air in Israel. And in fact, amongst people on the right, it's actually almost embraced, in the sense that they say, whatever you want to call it, they can't have a state. We have the state. We're not going to expel them, so they have to live here. And whatever you want to call that, that's the way we're going to live. And so that kind of becomes the attitude on the right about this whole story. And then you find, I would say, amongst Israeli liberals and others, there's more real anguish about the whole term, because many of them still believe that we could have some kind of two-state solution. And unfortunately, I don't think that's in the tables now. And so for many of them, I think they're having a hard time dealing with the new reality, and whether that's the permanent reality that we're living in or not. And so still don't want to use that label. And in fact, even B'Tselem, which is a really important and really fantastic human rights organization, it was a really painful move for them to issue that report where they said, this is now, legally speaking, a kind of apartheid regime, and that exists here. And you have to read the document to see how they lay this out. But even for them, it was a very painful move. So I would say, do most Israelis accept it? No, they don't. They would rather not even think about it, honestly. Most Israelis just want to live their lives with their families, jobs, their careers, because they can. And they'd rather not talk about it, not think about it, is at least what I've experienced. Among those who are more politically aware, there's some kind of debate. So, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, it's a pretty heavy label.
Yeah.
So the final question we have tonight comes from Tom Rainey. Oh, yep. What role do you see Russia playing as the new arbiter in the Middle East?
Russia. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, that's not what I've been thinking about. Gosh, I don't even know where to start.
You've stretched us. Now we stretch you.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Russia and Ukraine is a big story right now, obviously, but from the Middle East perch, which is where I sit, Russia, Russia was basically trying to regain its prominence by supporting the Assad regime in Syria. Okay, and it was using the Assad regime. Basically, Russia came in and, along with Iran, saved the Assad regime from being overthrown, from the rebels defeating it. The rebels were going to defeat it. Russia came in, along with Iran, and saved the Assad regime at the expense, of course, of about 6 to 8 million Syrians and a destroyed country. Okay. But Russia was asserting itself as a player, and it's here to stay in the Middle East. It is trying to be a negotiator amongst various forces in the Middle East, particularly around Iran. So does it play any role in the Israeli-Palestinian situation? I would argue no. I would argue there's not really any role for Russia here. in this situation that we're talking about. So where Russia's kind of interested, if you're interested in that question, is it's trying to get into Africa. It's interested in some of the new mineral resources in Africa. It's made alliances with Central African Republic, with Chad, some other places as well. But no, it's not a big part of our story here.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking the question. And
Yeah,
that
sure.
really concludes all of our questions for tonight. So
Okay.
I want to thank you on behalf of the Olympia World Affairs Council and everyone who's in attendance. There's several comments in the chat box thanking you
Yeah,
for a
take a look.
very interesting, insightful,
Yeah.
and knowledgeable presentation. So we thank you so much. And
Yeah,
before
thank you.
everybody leaves, I want to invite you, of course, to our next presentation, which will be on February 17th. Same time, same Zoom link. We'll be hearing from Professor Seth Weinberger from the University of Puget Sound, who's going to talk to us about the relationship between the U.S. and Iran, and potentially how that has differed between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So we'll see what direction he takes with that. So thank you again, Steve, and thank you everyone
all
for joining us.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
All right. Good night.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Diane and Nadia.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve.
Tom's yelling from the end of the room there, Steve.
Oh, I'm
Thank
glad to
you.
see Tom there. Yeah.
That was great.
That's right.
We were just,
Yeah, well, I told you I was going to try and challenge you all. I hope I did.
Hey, you did.
yeah,
You
that was-
did.
It was so informative that I'm pretty sure I'd fail your class. Pretty sure.
Russia with a
Well,
red.
that's, yeah. Well, in my class, we would do that over 4 weeks. So
yeah.
I just had to give you that. Yeah.
Steve, quick question since you're still on the line.
Yeah.
Tom and I are wondering, do you know about the Iran-Russia connection?
Détente.
The détente and
More
then
than the détente. Yeah, the new alliance that's forming between the two of them.
there's sort of a new alliance.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right. I know, like I said, Russia and Iran saved Syria. And they've kind of created this little alignment where they're like, they'll be that axis in the Middle East against the Saudi, Israeli, and Trump, and now Biden kind of, they have a little different take on that whole situation. But basically, we've got two axes. Yeah, Iran, Syria, and Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great.
sure.
Thanks, Steve.
But let's hope that tamps down. I'm all for negotiations and diplomacy.
Right.
I actually think you could have a region that didn't have to divide into these axes, honestly.
Yes.
We need to get back to that Iran nuclear deal. We desperately need that. And then give the Iranian citizens a chance to redefine Iran. And then maybe Saudi citizens would get a chance to redefine Saudi Arabia. That's my long-term hope, you know. So
You're
let's see.
You're also welcome to come to next month's presentation. Same Zoom link as tonight if you want to.
You mean with Seth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
See what he has to say about it all.
I don't really know. I don't know Seth. But I think we have a different perspective on a number of issues. But I know he's also a good analyst, and I always appreciate, even if I disagree, to have someone who's a good analyst. So,
right.
Yeah, that could be interesting. But no, the floor is Seth's. You know, I mean, I could throw a question out, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you guys should, that should be really interesting. I hope to look forward to that. So, okay, I guess I should get off. Anyway,
All right, thanks
you guys.
everyone.
Steve,
Take care.
bye.